My name is Sonia Nusser. I am the chair of WISE this year, and I'm going to welcome our speaker for today. We're very excited, and thank you, Soderholm, for inviting us in here. So our speaker today is Todd Edman. He is a lifelong entrepreneur. He was born in Eugene, Oregon, and loves his ducks and local food and wine. He's a songwriter, which is fascinating, and I have more questions about that. Guitarist, gardener, woodworker, and is restoring a 1969 Buick Skylark because he's crazy. And I presume what he's going to talk about today is he and his co-founders invented the Apple AirTag for food, which brings inventory transparency to the industry and allows companies to collaborate on transport and other critical services. So welcome, Mr. Edman, and
thank you.
We're very excited to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, so what I'll be talking about a little bit today is specifically in terms of math, science, and engineering, and how that's impacting me in my life. And, you know, how things that I learned in my high school calculus classes, it absolutely shocked me how often I come back to them and how glad I am that I know them. So let me start by saying that the varied things that I do are because I've followed a very wandering path over the years, finding different things that interest me, finding different things that engage me. And I think that one of the common threads of those things is that they always brought me back to math. It always brought me back. Whatever I did, always brought me back to math. And I would say that I started out with a lukewarm interest. I did, you know, math, and I went to started to go to engineering school, but I didn't finish engineering school, and I dropped out, and I went back and found other passions that I love. But what I think that has really been impactful and profounding is everything that I learned up through the classes that I took in engineering school translated forward to understanding the world around me. And I think that I'm going to give some specific examples of that and sort of break some of that down. But the thing that people say is math's all around you. You need to use it no matter where you go, so on and so forth. I think that's mostly true. Now, I think there's people who go through their jobs and do different things without trying to understand the math. And I think trying to understand the math and how that influences things it's like a superpower. It gives you the ability to see things other people can't see. And for the first example for that, I'm going to take you back to the start of 2020, when my business was not called Pollinate Food, it was called Bit Cork, and we were a wine distributor to restaurants. So I had started, when we started this business, we had come up with some ideas and some math models about how the world would behave when we injected our new product into it. The existing model for restaurants is that on Tuesday or Wednesday, depending on the wine distributor that they're working with, a company goes in and they place an order. And they place an order for wine. And they have to do that before noon on the day so that they make the cutoff. Then they wait a couple of days, and their delivery day will be Thursday or Friday. And the delivery truck will show up with their wine, delivering it to the restaurant. Some interesting information about that. 13% of wine orders are delivered incorrectly. So if you think about that, if you've got one distributor working with 13 wine orders delivered incorrectly, I mean, you're going to run into that 1 in every 6 times, right? 1 in every 7, something like that. If you're dealing with 4 wine distributors, you're going to run into it every other week, where an incorrect order is going to arrive. And some weeks, because random data points are scattered, some weeks out of your 4 or 5 deliveries, 3 of them will be wrong. So that's pretty profound for a restaurant. That's something that they struggle with, because every order that arrives, they have to check it against the invoice, make sure it's billed properly, and put the wine away. Well, that's kind of a challenge in a restaurant when you're in the middle of lunch rush. And that's you don't have control about when your deliveries get there. They just get there when the wine distributor drops them off. And I thought this was an inconvenient model for the restaurant. And I thought in the age of Amazon, that was nuts. So we decided to do it differently. And what we did is put all of our wine that we represented into a smartphone app. Restaurateurs could browse the wine. They could select one of the wines they wanted, and they would order a sample. The sample would just show up via bike courier at the restaurant. They could pull the cork on the bottle, take a sample of the wine, determine whether they wanted to carry it in their restaurant or not. If they did, they could just say, I want 6 bottles or 2 bottles or 1 bottle, and we would deliver it by bike courier to the restaurant. And they could set a delivery time that they wanted it to arrive as long as it was more than 24 hours in advance. So what ended up happening is that functionally our wine distributor was 10 times better at delivering wine. So 10 times faster than a typical wine distributor, because we actually, after some work, we discovered that we could allow people to order up to 2 hours. And sometimes they would just order as soon as it can be here, and we could deliver in less than 20 minutes. We would be able to let them carry more wine, specialty wines, because if they ran out on a Friday evening, they could order wine to show up on a Saturday morning, more of the same type of wine. So they didn't need to carry as much inventory. It was faster. And we did, using our technology, we did 1,200 deliveries. And out of those 1,200 deliveries, only 2 of them occurred where the wine order ended up at the restaurant incorrectly. And it was, both times it was the wrong year of a wine, which in wine, it's a substantial deal. But this is not the mistakes that most other wine distributors made, where they delivered 4 cases, 8 cases, 10 cases. So I started to look at the behavior of the restaurants very early on. First 10 restaurants we delivered to, and started to chart their behavior. How many weeks did it take them to change their behavior? Because most restaurants would order on a Wednesday or Tuesday before noon, like they always had with us. And then they would change their behavior. So how many days did it take them to change their behavior? And I recorded that in a spreadsheet. And then I recorded how many days until they ordered the second wine, their first wine with a different one they ordered. How long did it take them after they ordered a sample? And I started putting all of this data into a spreadsheet. And then I modeled it. So growth curves, one of the cool tools you can use for a growth curve is modeling using the arctangent curve. So it's nice. It's like a X3 curve on its side, cubic on its side. And one of the cool things about it is that it creates initial growth, which is slow. Then there's a period of increasing linear growth, and then there's a cap on the end of it. And that's how most growth in businesses occur, like individually. And then you can stack that curve to create projections for what growth looks like in a business. And then those stacked curves come out looking more like exponential growth when you stack them up. So understanding that this is actually how banking they use the arctangent curve to project growth. I started modeling using that data. What I came out with was a model that said, for these restaurants and this distribution, this is what you expect when you add each restaurant. And then knowing that I'm getting random inputs into my data and that my first 5 restaurants might not represent the other ones, I created a little coefficient in my spreadsheet for my accuracy, which was, how good am I doing at projecting the data to the actuals? Then I pulled all my data from my spreadsheets and I put it into my model. And then as the model moved forward, I watched it. And what I watched was, after being in restaurants for 6 months to capture my initial data, and then capturing data for the next 2 months, for January and February of 2019, the data said that it would take a new wine rep 9 months to break even. A new wine rep would take 9 months to break even. And so I looked at the amount of cash I had in the bank for the entrepreneurship for my business that I had raised. I looked at what our timelines looked like. And I began looking for a wine rep because that wine rep would turn cash flow positive before I needed to raise more money. So it was an easy decision. I'm going to go hire a wine rep. So I went out, found the right wine rep, someone that was experienced in the industry. We brought her on, we hired her. For the first 2 to 3 months, she didn't track, which is pretty common because in sales, there's a ramp up time. And I forgot to model the ramp up time. So the ramp up time turned out to be 3 months, 3 months until their projections began to match mine. I talked with that sales rep at length, understood what the ramp up time challenges were, and began to punch them into the model. And then also began to develop ways to address them. So the next wine rep that I hired, we would be able to bring on and have an expectation that they would have less ramp up time. So instead of 9 months, it was going to take 12 for her to hit break even. So she comes on in summer of 2019. And by the time February of 2020 hits, she is clearly on this path. My coefficient for my accuracy number was actually 1.12, which told me that she was actually slightly outperforming my model. This gave me a lot of confidence. So 3 months in fall, I hired our second rep. We shortcutted the things that created the longer time frame. We got that rep into the right market with the right people. And what do you know? 3 months later, she was tracking very, very closely to expected behavior. So those two wine reps together did an excellent job of representing my mathematical model for how that advanced. COVID hit in 2020, and all the restaurants shut down. And at the time that the restaurant shut down, we were growing 120% quarter over quarter. That means the previous quarter, we were doing 120% better than the previous quarter. The previous quarter was December. There is no way that the first quarter we should be selling more wine than we would in December. So if you think back to how I modeled it, how I looked at the data, I also had a factor in there for adjusting for seasonality. Without that, it would have been insanely expensive. I'd never been able to hire the wine rep at the right time. When I hired the wine rep 3 months in, I wouldn't have known that they weren't performing like they were supposed to. I wouldn't have known to troubleshoot that. After they began performing very well and matching the curve, I wouldn't have known when to hire the second rep. I wouldn't have known what the changes that I made working with the first wine rep, how they were likely to impact the model. All of these things we wouldn't have known. Now, of course, the real world doesn't always follow math. And when restaurants closed, we went to almost no wine because with no restaurants open, we're not selling wine. And restaurants started selling through their own wine inventories. That totally messed up my model. My model no longer functioned well at all. And we are in the pandemic. So suddenly, no one is going to write a check because I built this business to be a venture scale business and we were in the middle of raising money. My model panned out. We knew what the return time was. We knew we could grow our business sustainably by hiring new reps. Everything is working. But the pandemic completely destroys my fundraising process. And all the people that were going to write checks said, you know what, right now, we're just not going to make investments in that sort of business. So here I am, hiring the right people, doing the right math, and the world has other ideas. So what did I do? Well, I called my friend Teresa Wolf. Dr. Teresa Wolf worked at the CDC. And she didn't work at the CDC when I called her. She had actually moved on and was a professor at Portland State University. And I had a conversation with her. We talked about the math models for the pandemic. She gave me insight to how they functioned. She told me about how the transmission rates worked. And she told me what she suspected, which was that way more people were infected with COVID than was being reported in the official numbers. And that meant that if that was the case, that it fit this curve that typically epidemiologists normally use to project, infection rates. So following that data, I took one quick look at it, did a little model, and took one quick look at it and went, oh God, oh God, restaurants are shutting down. But even as they're just shutting down, I'm like, there is no way we're coming out of the pandemic anytime soon. Hospitalization rates, once you start bumping up against the maximum amount of people that can be hospitalized, you have to do something as a society, because you're talking, if people are laying outside a hospital with no place to go, dying, you're talking about like societal breakdown. And I knew that there's no way the government or the powers that be would try and allow that, and that would be a realistic scenario in many places. And so now how do I use that knowledge and change what I'm going to do? So I talked with Teresa about it, and we came up with some kind of ideas and some rules moving forward. And she said, look, the fastest we're going to develop a vaccine, from the point that the push to develop vaccines happened, you could say is a year. That's the fastest it will be generally available. And then 3 months after that is the fastest that the distribution tech will get up and running, so that we can actually get significant infection or significant people vaccinated and the rates die down. And then about a month to a month and a half after that are when you will see restaurants begin to open back up, because the rates will decline. So I went ahead and threw that in a timeline and took a look at it. And through that timeline, it told me a few things. One, that it was enough time that people were going to substantially change their behavior patterns. Because we're locked down, e-commerce was going to change. Supermarkets were going to change. Supply chain shortages were almost certainly going to be a thing. And suddenly the thing that I was working on and doing in wine became cool. No one ever talked about the supply chain before 2020. And in 2020, it was one of the hot topics. So now I'm in 2020. I'm thinking about the supply chain, and I'm looking at the little math model that I made for selling wine in restaurants. And I started to ask myself some questions. And those questions looked like, what areas that are being impacted right now by the pandemic? What areas that are being impacted by the pandemic have models similar to what I was thinking of in wine? Where would our technology that we would use have a significant impact other than wine? And I started to look at food, because the supply chain was being disrupted, and essentially wine is food, and we'd always thought about maybe doing food eventually anyway. And so we began to model it. And when I punched in the numbers for food, and I looked at the curves, and I looked at the projections, my breath caught, because we weren't talking about like a 9-month return on time. We were talking about like a 60-day return at the very beginning of the growth curve, a 60-day return on a salesperson. Now, typically a 9-month return or 12-month return on a salesperson is very good. That's a sustainable model that you can totally deal with. A 1-month return is insane. Like, you would never have the guts to pitch that to investors and say, we can hire a salesperson and pay for them. And so I started looking for holes in my model. So I started interviewing people. And math gave me the background to interview them and ask them the questions. When you do X, how long does it take? When you do Y, how long does it take? What percentage of your time is spent doing these things? And I started to understand something. That the problem we had solved in our warehouse and our warehousing system that allowed 10 times faster delivery of wine to restaurants, 10 times cheaper, actually, as it turned out. A delivery truck to deliver wine to restaurants costs $120. We were doing it for $8.50. That's substantially better than 10 times. And 10 times more reliably. Our error rates were so low that they were actually 2 orders of magnitude. So 100 times more accurate in delivering wine to restaurants. So looking at all of these things, I started to get the idea that perhaps our technology could be used directly in the businesses, not just in our warehouses, but directly in the businesses. And so Justin and my co-founder and I started talking about it. We talked about, revenue models, growth models, and how we could build this business. And so I started all over and built new models. And I interviewed people from trucking, and I learned, and logistics. And what I learned is that logistics had its own set of math that described it. It had math to describe how warehouses functioned. It had math to describe how trucking functioned. It had math to describe the productivity of individual workers. It had math to describe how networks move product. So, you think about a network like the internet, and it transmits data. Data is packetized. So you take a packet of data and you move it along the network. Now, telecom networks aren't packetized. They work on switching networks. So you have basically a pipe, and the pipe gets connected to a new pipe, and then all the data is sent over that pipe. So you have packet networks and switching networks. And there's data that talks about how packet networks and switching networks are different, when they're efficient, which ones you should use. And I recognize that the math for trucking and transport matched network switching models. So I went ahead and I took a look at math for packetizing that, and specifically packetizing it in the last mile. The last mile is when you go from a warehouse that's delivering to individuals or businesses outside of a city, and they drive from that warehouse with all the stuff loaded up into a box truck and drop it off. So I looked at that math, and to look at that math, I went and talked to a professor at the U of O who specialized in that math. I went ahead and chatted with him a little bit to try and understand how his math functioned. He sent me to some sites, gave me some data, and said, this is how those pieces work. So I went out and learned some new math. Once I had that math, and I had the network switching and the packet switching, and by the way, packetizing is like when you send a piece of data on the internet, it might be like a 1 gig file. That 1 gig file doesn't transfer all at once down one pipe. It gets broken up into chunks. How big the chunks are depends on the network protocol. Breaks down all those chunks, you send it over the internet. A lot of times those chunks will take different paths to the final computer. They'll get routed differently just depending on the network. And then once those chunks or packetized chunks arrive back at their final location, they get reassembled because they all have a number and the order in which they should be reassembled. And if sometimes you download a file and it says the file download failed, what that means is they didn't get all the chunks of the packet and they want to re-download it again. So I applied that math to the math talking specifically about supply chains. And what it said is that the model we were using for last mile delivery should be 10 times cheaper, 10 times faster, and 2 orders of magnitude less in error rates. And that confirmed what we had already seen. And now I had a new model. So now what happens when I apply that model to a city like Portland? It so profoundly changes the behavior of the entities in the business that it would change all of food. It would change where we grow food, how food is transported, who buys it, who sells it, probably actors. Walmart would struggle to maintain its efficiency advantage when a small food business could actually order and get food for less money than Walmart. Because a head of lettuce takes 20 cents in gasoline to move from the field in California to its average destination 1,000 miles away. That 20 cents, right? 35 cents is what it takes to pick the head of lettuce. So it's what it takes to grow it and pick it out of the field, 35 cents. 20 cents of that is what it takes it to get just the fuel to get it to the warehouse. Another like 18 or 20 cents is the logistics costs of having people handle it, ship it, unload it, load it, reload it. And the average piece of food actually changes hands 6 times. So when I started looking at these models, I went, wow, local businesses could actually buy it wholesale using this model for less money than Walmart. That's going to change everything in the industry. So I asked myself, has this ever happened before? Like, this is a profound shift that had never happened before. And I started doing some research, and I found out that there was a thing called the barcode. Now, if you know about the barcode, it's black and white lines. You can scan it with a laser gun and it gives you the number. It was invented in 1952, 54 by a guy sitting on the beach combing his fingers in the sand. And then he came up with this concept. But it wasn't until someone invented a key component, the barcode scanner, that it really changed things. Because the scanner, the desktop scanner, allowed a checker in a grocery store to scan an item. And that changed the checkout time in a grocery store. It also changed the amount of items that could be carried in a grocery store. So there used to be kind of a limited number of items you could logistically manage inside of a grocery store. That all changed. That number went from, 2,500, 3,000 to 50,000. And what we saw is the rise of the supermarket era as a result. And it completely changed all of food. It changed where it was grown. It changed who bought it, who sold it, the companies that controlled it. And what you saw is actually an entity that was called, I'm trying to remember the name of it, but I'm not gonna be able to look for it. But it was something funky like East Coast Trading and Exchange Company. They were as ubiquitous during their time in the 70s as Walmart was now. And they basically had a model that no longer functioned with the math that the barcode brought about. And their company decayed. It didn't go out of business. It's still operating, but it's not even in the top 100 biggest grocery store chains. It's still operating, and it got swallowed by someone else. But Walmart specifically, better than any company, said the change the barcode had to register would be more profound if we could push it all the way down the supply chain. And the genius of Sam Walton was looking at that and saying, we need bigger computers. It was Sam Walton who went, we're going to need bigger computers if we're going to tackle grocery, because Walmart existed. They were doing consumer goods. They were like a Target without the grocery. And they wanted to move into grocery and expand. And in order to do that, they knew that they'd have to manage their supply chain differently. And they'd have to use new sets of math and have projections for orders and be able to manage their supply chain in a completely different way. So they changed who they bought groceries from. They wrote contracts in such a way. They went and found individual food producers that would package products the way they would want to distribute nationally. And it shifted. When I shifted, it used to be that lettuce is a crop that most areas can grow by themselves. And in the 60s and the 70s, that was mostly true. Lettuce was distributed throughout the United States. 94% of lettuce is grown in one area in California. One area. There's 147,000 acres planted to lettuce in the entire United States. And greater than 90% of them is one area in Southern California. Now think about that. Think about everything that has to change in a supply chain and a country and farmers and tractors and fertilizing, and distribution and processing, all up and down the supply chain to make that happen. That's profound. That's profound. And so now we have our product, which can have as profound of change. And the reason that I know this is all because of the math. It's all because of the math. And I could look back through my career, and it doesn't really matter what I was doing, whether it was marketing, whether it was logistics, sales, accounting, it doesn't matter. Having the math behind you behind me has always been a superpower. Not that I had to be able to do all of the math all of the time, because I'm not like a genius math whiz. I got a 4 on my AP exam. I was stoked because I was pretty sure that I was not going to pass. And in college, I struggled with higher level math. I had to take some math courses twice. So I'm not like an A+ math student. But what always was in my court was my willingness to look and understand the math, take what I know and build upon it. And I can't say how profoundly that has affected every path every path in my life. I have a friend of mine who, Teresa Bailey, who is a nuclear scientist at a research facility in the Bay Area, nuclear research facility in the Bay Area. And I absolutely love, I don't speak to her very often, like once every 2 or 3 years. But when I sit down with her, she's so good and she's so smart and so good at math. And it just like talking with her about her work and how the math plays out in her work and what types of things she does is intensely fascinating to me now. And it is so wonderful to be able to have that conversation, try to extract that information and understand how the world works. And believe it or not, like understanding sums, limits, how velocities relate, derivatives, exponents, power rules, statistical distribution. Stoke was literally having a conversation with someone who's going to help me raise money in this round because we're out there trying to raise additional funds. And he and I were talking. He's from Austin, Texas, and he and I were talking about stochastic margin of error and how you use that to project the supply and demand needs of a given restaurant. So I'm going to talk for a second now. Let me check my time here. Let's see, it's 10:52. So I'm about 20 plus minutes in. So I'll probably wrap up here and then go into questions. Is that okay in terms of time? I always want to do a time check.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, great. So basically, like stochastic margin of error says that when you have items above and below a projected curve, that when you look at that projection, that the number of items above and the number of items below will offset each other. And that's what's called the simple version of stochastic margin of error. But that's incredibly valuable if you think about it, because if you can look at the number of products that you're keeping in an area, and you look and someone or a group of someone's are ordering less of a given product, then you can also make a bet that other people might order more. And so you can look and say, hey, look, do inventory levels in this region follow a random distribution, or do they follow a type of distribution that is a random distribution of stochastic margin of error? If it's stochastic margin of error, that's great. Because that means that whatever you have, if it's not bought by one person, it'll be bought by another person. You just have to have a wide enough net cast across different types of businesses to understand how that's going to function. Which means, for me, my future is going to be data science. Now, we've talked about math. We've talked about different types of curves, talking about projecting, using curves to match growth. Data science is a different ballgame. Data science is a specialty area of math where you're dealing with really large data sets. One type of data analysis that I'm familiar with, that's a type of training a Bayesian network. Bayesian networks are like artificial intelligence. Bayesians are like a neural network. So Bayesian network trained with topographical data analysis. So topographical data analysis, the best way I can describe that is topographical data analysis is math analysis that you would do, and it wouldn't be able to tell you the difference between a coffee and a donut, because to the topographical data analysis, they look exactly the same. They're the same price. They're consumed at the same time. They're at the same time of the day. They're consumed in the same places. They're very, very similar. So topographical kind of gives you an idea of what you're working with, and then you train a Bayesian network with topographical, and then you feed it with data points, 8 million data points. And the Bayesian network makes guesses at the behavior, and when it's right, it rewards itself and it grows a new set of neurons. And when it doesn't, it's wrong and it kills those neurons off. And that's kind of how it works. You train that Bayesian network, and then you can start making projections with it and see how good the networks are. Then you can compare that to a traditional model and say, what's better? Is statistical projection better, or is my trained artificial intelligence better? And what we're finding when I say we, it means the entire world is finding, is that there's many problems for which artificial intelligence trained networks are doing a substantially better job. And this is not a horizon that is anywhere close to mature. I would say that this is still an area that's maybe in its infancy or possibly in its adolescence. It is just not mature at all. There is so much left to discover, so many new algorithms, specialties, and it's going to so profoundly impact our world. It's going to impact how we get food at our door. It's going to impact what our jobs are. It's going to eliminate jobs from the workforce. It's going to make some companies massively more profitable. Insurance companies are an example, because once you can take in a form, use a Bayesian network to do analysis on it and read all the data in that once someone's filled it out really accurately, you suddenly eliminate a massive amount of jobs in insurance. And once you eliminate jobs in insurance, what you can do is become more competitive by offering insurance for 1 penny less. And it completely changes the entirety of insurance markets. So this type of math is going to be surrounding everyone in the future, no matter what job you do. And I think it's a profound superpower to understand that and to be willing to look at math and the pieces of math that are around you and how they interact, compare them to the real world. Because once you do that, you can get a peek at the underlying structure that determines what the future looks like. And again, I think that's a profound superpower. So cool, we'll go to questions.